This has really been a really incredible week of terrific presenters, and I can't thank everyone enough for coming, and I can't thank the presenters enough for giving their time in putting together these important bodies of work. I want to thank Photo Daily and Photo Shelter and Epson and American Photography for supporting us, over the course of the year. I thank everyone. I also need to do a quick shout out to Jay, our tech guy, who've coordinated this all through the week, and without him, I really would have no hair at all. He just coordinates everything and makes it run smoothly. Where all I am is nervous all the time. Tonight we have Ron Haviv, who's the founder of Seven, a very, very dear friend of mine, and been to Ukraine twice now, I think, back and forth, and he's planning on going again. And Ron, thank you so much for being here and doing this for us. And we let you share the screen, and off we go.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Jay, for your dedication in talking about this story. And thank you all for coming. I know there's been a lot of, you have seen multiple presentations on this story. I think that there, of course, is some overlap between all of us. I think the most important overlap between myself and the photographers that have presented in the last weeks or so is our true belief that it's incredibly important to continue to understand, to continue to document and discuss and understand the impact of what this war means, not only for the Ukrainians and the Russians, but the rest of the world, as it becomes more and more apparent that the potential of this conflict is spilling over in various ways. Obviously, economically, here in the United States, we're already feeling some of the impact. And of course, there are other things that might be coming going forward. So I just to give you a little bit of background on my involvement in this. I've been following the story of Ukraine, the possibility of something happening like many people in the world throughout the end of last year and the beginning of this year, and was basically preparing to get ready to go at the necessary time. But when that time was, it was hard to say. If you guys recall now, it seems like such a long time ago, but it's really roughly only 3 months ago when President Biden started giving out warnings and being very transparent with intelligence of what the Americans felt was going to happen, which the European community did not agree with. The Americans felt that there was going to be a full-on invasion. Even the Ukrainians themselves were reasonably reluctant to believe it. By the third or fourth time that Biden said that the invasion was going to happen and airlines started to cancel their flights, I flew to Ukraine on February 15th. The war began on February 24th. And upon my arrival, it was a really interesting kind of mix of tension and lack of tension. They were starting to train civilians on how to fight, starting them off with how to hold a stick, mimicking a gun, running through various different training exercises, moving them up to fighting with learning how to use regular weapons and so on. But at the same time, the cafes were open, the restaurants were open, and most people really, certainly the people on the street, the people that I were talking to, did not believe that there was going to be an invasion. They thought it was a bluff. And perhaps if there was any military action, it would be happening more towards the east, where already they've been fighting a war since 2014. And they thought that maybe that would be increased to some sort of level. Russian involvement might be increased. Nobody actually really believed, or at least the people that I spoke with, were really believing that the Russians were going to come across the way that they did. And things changed very rapidly. The night of February 23rd, I was in a really nice restaurant, packed with people, having a really great meal with borscht, a very Ukrainian special soup, and so on, and joking around with colleagues and Ukrainians and so on. And less than 12 hours later, the war began. The capital was attacked. Other places were starting to be attacked. troops started to move across the border, and immediately the reality changed on the ground. And myself, like many analysts and so on, as I looked around, especially as I was based in the capital, and I saw almost no defense, no troops on the street, very few barricades, checkpoints, military vehicles, and so on. It seemed very difficult to believe that the Ukrainians were going to even be able to hold the capital as large as it was. It brought me back to 30 years ago, this past April, when I was in Sarajevo, which was the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, another city which people thought was going, or another country that people thought was going to fall very quickly when it was being attacked, and was defended by the civilians of the city. And that war wound up lasting 4 years. And it seems that Ukraine, kind of taking a playbook out of the Bosnian playbook, was able to stop the initial push forward, certainly around the capital in Kyiv, and the civilians sort of bearing some of the brunt of the damage as different attacks started to happen, civilian apartment blocks and so on. And very quickly, they were able to, the Ukrainians started to basically militarize civilians. The army, special units started to go into place, and were able to be very successful very quickly. They were, of course, funded with weapons from the Europeans and the Americans. They knew how to fight with them. And of course, the way that they were fighting was very successful in terms of the way they were fighting against the Russians. And all of a sudden, the war started to change a little bit differently. The tensions on the streets in the capital themselves was extremely high. People were being arrested, being accused of being a Russian spy, like this man here. And nobody really knew exactly what was going to happen next. And the militarization, more and more people volunteering, more and more people going to the front, and more people basically learning in a classroom one day and all of a sudden being in a trench the next day to support the professional soldiers.
So Ron,
Yeah.
I mean, as much as as you saw or felt that they weren't prepared, behind the scenes, they had some mechanisms sort of getting in line so that they couldn't.
They did have mechanisms in line, and they were also lucky in the way that the Russians were fighting, which was rather inept and not what people had expected. So the way that the Ukrainians had been being trained by the Americans for a number of years in sort of fighting American NATO style, which is designed to fight against the Russians. The command structure is different. The NATO American way gives a lot more responsibility to smaller units. They're more independent, and especially with new weaponry like the Javelin and in-laws, where you could send 6 guys off to go attack a column of tanks, they can be very successful, which they were. But certainly for the first month or so, certainly in the capital, people still were waiting for cruise missiles, which did come a little bit, for more Russian soldiers to come. But the Ukrainians themselves really were able to hold them off pretty well. And they were also, more importantly, the spirit of the Ukrainian people was incredibly high and very proud. And so, in fact, what the government decided to do was to try to involve the civilian population in as many ways as possible. And if you might recall, there was at one point a desire and a methodology of everybody should make Molotov cocktails for when the tanks came out onto the streets, everybody could become a soldier. And this is a series of Molotov cocktails being made in an underground factory by Ukrainian civilians. And this basically...
I'm sorry, what were the white things in the bottles there?
They're styrofoam. It's to help the fuel stick to the bottle so it explodes when it hits the vehicle. So while in the end they didn't really wind up using Molotov cocktails, what it did do was this real unification, not only in the capital but throughout the country, of getting everybody involved and behind the war effort, as the war effort started to come to many different places around the country. And there was it's hard to tell, and it's still to this day hard to understand exactly what the Russian strategy was, especially within the capital itself, because there would be random apartment buildings that were being hit with heavy artillery, sometimes a cruise missile, and so on. And sometimes the target would be obvious; it'd be a military target or an intelligence target. But other times it was hard to tell whether the Russians were just missing targets or they were using this to just sort of cause fear throughout the population, which of course is what it did, as a number of people were killed as their buildings were destroyed. It also then forced the population into moving underground. So the air raid system, which was quite efficient, that anytime a plane or a missile was detected from leaving any territory held by Russians, air raid sirens would go off depending on where they thought which city was going to get hit. So people wound up living a large degree in these underground railway stations, which were created to actually be bunkers, nuclear bunkers, during the Soviet times. So very, very deep bunkers in which you sometimes might take you to 3 to 4 minutes on an escalator to go all the way down to the bottom. And basically, people would start living in these air raid shelters / train stations, and the trains also kept going. So there'd be people living in the train station while people were also commuting back and forth from one area of the city to another. So you had all of these kind of different mixes of normality of life mixing with wartime life at the same time, and in many kind of ways. Not that I'm old enough to remember the Blitz in London, but certainly remembering the photographs I saw during World War II of how the British were living also in their underground. It seemed very much similar kind of scenes to that. And while now Kyiv, of course, is relatively safe, even though it's occasionally getting bombed, other parts of Ukraine, people are continuing now to live in the train stations. And this is one of the most amazing things that I noticed was, one, in most places it was always quiet. Children were well behaved, numerous pets, well behaved pets, people cleaning up after themselves, professional cleaning workers working, keeping the train stations clean, sharing of electricity for obviously smartphones, computers, and so on. Wi-Fi was working underground, and it was quite, again, kind of this resilience and spirit of the people was, and still to this day, I think, absolutely remarkable. To be honest with you, I am really unsure, like if New Yorkers were put through a similar situation like this, how great it would be to be in the Times Square train station at the similar situation. But this was quite remarkable. And so a lot of life for the Ukrainians started to become underground in hospitals. This is a scene from the Children's Hospital in Kyiv, where before they were able to evacuate the oncology unit and all the other kids who were in serious medical conditions, they were all moved downstairs. The hospital was bombed by the Russians, and surgeries were taking place underground. You can see here, obviously this is not a clean medical environment, but this is where people were winding up. And also, this woman had just given birth to her child about 3 hours before this photograph was taken in a basement. So as often in wartime situations, you have this clash of normal life having to continue due to medical reasons, or just people wanting their life to continue, not to be giving in to the enemy and wanting to keep their life going, or making sure obviously their child is born as safely as possible, clashing with the reality of surviving in a war zone.
So Ron, getting into the hospital and into the subway station, do you need access or you can just go?
Access was a continued problem in this conflict. One of the main reasons that access was always very difficult was that because of these Russian saboteurs who did exist, people were being arrested with weapons, with plans, and so on. Everybody was suspicious of everybody who was not only not foreigner, because obviously the Russians could also be Ukrainians with Russian heritage and so on. So it was difficult. You had to have accreditation from the government and accreditation from the military. And even with that, it would be often difficult to be able to get access to certain things. And sometimes there were times when the Ukrainians wanted to make sure the world saw what was going on, and they would make sure that we had access, especially like in a hospital at certain points. And at certain points, it was more of negotiating and trying to convince the director to let you into the hospital and so on. And so kind of also like kind of this idea of keeping life normal. This is a couple who was engaged before the war. And so the military decided when they said they wanted to get married, they would have a military wedding, and they obviously invited their fellow soldiers, but also invited the media, basically kind of to show and to gather some empathy for the Ukrainian cause. It appeared to be, a real marriage. They were in love and so on, but at the same time, a bit of a photo op, but also a bit of reality. And of course, it's our job as journalists to determine like what's propaganda, what's real, what's not real. And for me, I thought, while this was staged to some degree, it still was a real wedding, and it did reference kind of that Ukrainian spirit that I've been talking about going forward. And while all these different things are happening, often in war zones, the difference between a mile life 1 mile north versus 1 mile south is dramatic. So while I was in Kyiv and the city was under attack, it's such a large city, and that there was, and it was still unclear why, but the power stayed on my whole time there. The 2 months that I was there was always power. Even more surprising, there was always internet, which we had always thought the Russians would shut off. And there was always mobile phone service, which we thought the Russians would turn off. But we found out later the Russians couldn't turn off because the Russians themselves needed the mobile networks to communicate with each other because their communications weren't working. But even so, 1 mile away, and this is in an area of 2 towns called Irpin and Bucha, which are suburbs of Kyiv and very key to the defense of the capital. People are here, were being ethnically cleansed from their homes day in and day out. And it was at times very difficult to get to the areas where they were being cleansed. It would be difficult because the Ukrainians wouldn't let you get through, or it would be difficult because they were too close to the Russians. And if you guys have been following the story over the last couple of months now, I think the number is 23 journalists have been killed documenting this war, both Ukrainian and international journalists. So it's a lot of sort of juggling and deciding what you can do and what you can't do. But this was a very important moment. So basically, the Russians are about 100 meters, about 300 feet away from where I'm standing, where these people are. And sometimes the Russians would allow the people to leave, and sometimes they would say they could go, and then they would shoot the people. And it was always a very kind of tricky kind of situation. Nobody ever really knew or understood exactly what was going on. So this is basically, this is sort of, they've left their homes maybe 10 minutes before. You can see they were told you can go now. You can take one bag, go with your family. They have white armbands to signify that they're civilians, and they have absolutely no idea at this point if they're ever going home again, if they're ever going to see anything that they left behind, including probably most of their worldly goods. I mean, they have such little few things with them. And so watching this and photographing this day in and day out, you can see behind on the right in the center of the screen a civilian that was killed, doing the same thing a little bit earlier. Lines of hundreds of people crossing every day. And that they would even walk past, this is the body of a dead Russian soldier that had been killed fighting with Ukrainians. So they'd be walking past bodies of civilians, of Russians, of Ukrainians. And it was a horrific scene day in and day out. And then they would get to this bridge that would get them across the Irpin River, which is a very famous river going all the way back to World War II, which was also a defensive line that protected Kyiv when the Nazis were invading. And the Ukrainians blew up the bridge to stop the Russians from crossing. So while that was successful in stopping the Russian advance, then the civilians had to walk across a makeshift bridge to get to their sort of next stop of safety before getting to Kyiv, before beginning the next journey into displacement or becoming a refugee. So this became a point where myself and other journalists would go to document them coming across. Often there'd be sniper fire. And some of you, if you're familiar, Lindsay Dario from the New York Times was a little bit, maybe a few hundred feet away from this bridge, following people across the bridge. And after they had crossed the bridge, and a mortar had struck and killed a mother and her two children as they were escaping along this path.
And Ron,
So,
is this a safe place? I mean, where they're walking towards, is that a safe haven that they know is safe, or it's just we got to get out of here?
it's safer, but as I just said, 200 feet up the road, the route in the direction that they're going, people were also killed by mortars. Snipers were opening up fire. So the further they got away from the bridge, the safer that it became. But nothing was ever
Safe.
100% safe, and nobody knew, because Russians were moving around. So if you look kind of the trees to the left of this frame, maybe you go down 100 yards towards the left, there are Russian snipers that were there in the fields, who would occasionally open fire on the Ukrainian soldiers or the Ukrainian people as they were fleeing.
Yeah, and any way to determine like that intermittent shooting of people? I mean, like how does that happen? I mean, like the Russians just sitting there, like, oh, now would be a good time to shoot some people. I mean, is it that chaotic?
It's that random. I don't know about. I'm not sure chaotic is the word. I think it's just
Random,
it's
yeah.
random.
Right.
It could depend on whether or not. I mean, there are times when they're shooting civilians, but there are also times when soldiers are walking towards the front. Remember, these guys are coming from the front lines. Soldiers are also crossing the bridge to go to the front line, so they're crossing at the same time. There's weather issues. Obviously, there are days when they're doing it in the snow. There are days when it's sunny, days when it's raining. It's just a mix of different things. So this became very much kind of a symbol for what, at least certainly in my opinion, is pure ethnic cleansing. So documenting people who are fleeing their homes out of fear of being killed, persecution, because because they're not Russian, because they're Ukrainian. They're being targeted specifically because they are Ukrainian, and this is ethnic cleansing in my mind, which is a war crime. So, again, kind of like try to put yourself in their place. You're in a village, you're in your city. Your city is under attack. You're waiting. Should you leave? Should you not leave? Many people took days and weeks to leave because they thought it would be over, or they thought it wasn't safe because they knew that people were being killed as they were escaping, or especially the elderly, their children couldn't get to them. They had nobody to take care of them. There was nobody to help them out. People were coming out, being carried, being put in wheelbarrows, being put on stretchers, being put in wheelchairs. It was really, really, really very difficult decisions, life and death decisions that people were making at the time of what was going on here.
Ron, you mentioned war crimes. How does that work? I mean, at some point, do they say to the photojournalist, send your imagery for evidence? I mean, any feedback on that? Like, what's the process as far as evidence is concerned?
Well, I mean, essentially, first of all, this is happening. This is being in every newspaper, on every TV station, every day. So they're already gathering information. And we'll talk a little bit about Bucha in a little bit towards the end of the presentation, where there's more direct evidence of war crime in photography. But it's a process. There's various degrees of investigation and so on. There's also journalists who are trained to look specifically for war crimes that go into these scenes. And there's also, during the war, after the war in Bosnia, journalists Roy Gutman, Christian Amanpour, Gilles Perez, and others created a book, basically a handbook for journalists. Like, what is a war crime? How do you define a war crime? So it is imperative that those of us that go to war should know the rules, know the books, know what's what. So also can help us document something that maybe by the time the investigator arrives, that evidence is gone. So this is going to be a very long process on war crimes. This will take years and years to go through, and I'm sure my work and other people's work will eventually contribute to the overall record of what's going on. One of the questions I'm always asked at lectures is like, what do you do? Do you help? Do you take pictures? Do you not? So here's Eric Bouvet, a photographer from Seven, helping carry somebody across the bridge. Many of journalists, including myself, put down our cameras when we were needed and help people cross and help pick up bags and so on. It's not just we're just there just taking photographs and ignoring people that are in need, but when people have help from other people, then we're going to make sure that we're documenting what's going on around us. But it was this kept going on and on. There was so many people and so many people in need that it was necessary that for everybody that was there to contribute in whatever way they could. And we tried to contribute, myself and my colleagues, to contribute not only with the journalism that we were doing, but also trying to help people as they were moving forward at probably, the worst time of their life. And then once they kind of crossed the bridge and eventually kind of wound up outside of the range of artillery, they were taken by bus and they were brought to the capital, to Kyiv. And there they had to make their next decision, like what was the next part of their journey. And then many of them decided they were going to take a train and go west to Lviv. If you guys were watching CNN or others, you'll see that many journalists, TV journalists, are reporting from Lviv, which is in the west of Ukraine. Has been relatively safe, although it did get bombed this week. It's on the way to Poland. It's a 3-4 hour drive from Poland. So you would go from Kyiv to Lviv, and then from Lviv, you would decide whether you were staying there as a displaced person or you're going to become a refugee once you cross the border and moved into Poland or Moldova or Romania, Slovakia, other countries that are bordering Ukraine. And the train station was often quite chaotic. It was all free. It was first come, first served. Trains would pull up. Sometimes people would have absolutely no idea what city they were going to. As long as the train was moving away from Kyiv, they would get on the train. And so you would have these very desperate situations of people trying to flee. And one of the things that the Ukrainian government did very early on was that they made it illegal for any men between the ages of 18 and 60 were not allowed to leave the country. They could move around the country. They could take their families to Lviv or to the Polish border, but only women and men under the age of 18 or over 60 were allowed to leave. So you had this continuous thing of people moving back and forth, families being split apart, scenes of separation, which was obviously incredibly painful for the people involved. Again, people not knowing when they'd be able to see each other again, hoping that communications via internet and cell phone would last, but basically really moving into the unknown. You see Alona here, she's leaving her husband, taking her child, and just as the door is closing, she broke down crying as she's heading off, and her husband is staying behind. And people are also traveling by bus and by vehicle, and any kind of way that they can to be able to leave whichever area that they felt was too dangerous to be in. And so this is, I think, one of the greatest strengths of photography is that we see these statistics. Millions of people are displaced, millions have become refugees, but the numbers are incomprehensible. But then when you see a mother and child, and here this woman has just arrived after the bridge, she's getting in a vehicle, she's being taken to the next stage, but she's so relieved to have escaped alive and healthy with her child. And I think that photography has that ability to change the statistic into a face, into a human being, into something that we can empathize with, so that when the government says we're giving X amount of money for weaponry, hopefully you can make the connection in a better way. Like it's going, in this case, I think, to defend these people who are being attacked unnecessarily. And throughout this, every day there are funerals of civilians, there are funerals of soldiers. This is a mother, her only son is 18 years old. He was in the military for just a few weeks. and his position was overrun, and he was killed. And this is a funeral in the capital of Kiev. So the funerals are happening constantly, almost anywhere in the country when it's possible. We've also seen stories, and I'll show a little bit later, about the mass graves and so on, where the fighting is so dangerous and the fighting is so heavy that people are not able to even have a proper funeral, where people are not even able to be buried properly or even be identified, and either lying in the streets or lying in a mass grave, and that they're hoping later, once the fighting stops, that exhumations will take place, proper funerals can happen, respects can be placed onto the people, and families can at least know what's happened to their relatives. I was also fortunate enough to spend some time with the president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky. I was working most of my time. I was working on assignment for the Economist Group, and they were able to get access to the president, and I was able to spend roughly 2 hours with him in one of his bunker offices, which was quite an amazing experience. Given I've been doing this job for a long time, I've been around a lot of different leaders, from U.S. presidents to Nelson Mandela and others, and it's rare when for me at least, when you are in a room with somebody who has met history head on and so far has really held up well and is become a larger than life character. And that's what President Zelensky has become, in his ability to defend his nation, what he's done, especially in terms of public relations and negotiations, to be able to get the world, or majority of the world, to be supporting him with weapons and money and diplomacy is quite remarkable. And this conflict will go down, I think, as one of these amazing historical moments, and his actions and the actions of those around him will be remembered for a very long time, on how to handle if you're the David and Goliath story, how do you survive as David? It is quite remarkable. And in all types of wars, there's always very surreal scenes and things that you would never think you would see before, that all of a sudden come up to you. And this is one of these scenes where this is a Ukrainian man who's been arrested by Ukrainians. He's a looter. He was actually, after the people were fleeing their homes, he was found to be robbing their homes. So Ukrainian tradition has to tie people up to a pole. You stick a potato in their mouth as a sort of a sign of disrespect, and he stays there until the regular police come and arrest him and take him to jail. Which I found remarkable for myself was, of all the photographs that I posted on social media, this photograph had almost as much, or if not more, conversation about it than photographs of people being ethnically cleansed, which I thought was quite interesting conversation about what people are interested in terms of photography. And then another situation with this is with a wife and her husband who was killed in an ambush, and all around different types of barricades are being put up, different kinds of defenses, and very quickly from those early days that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk to within a week or two, the whole area became and continued to become militarized. Checkpoints, sandbags, tank traps, trenches, more and more soldiers, everything kind of happening more and more. Another interesting thing, which became kind of an ethical conversation for the journalists, was that the Ukrainians decided to parade the captured Russian soldiers before the media, which, depending on how people interpret the Geneva Convention, is either illegal or legal, depending on people's interpretation, whether they can be identified, how the photographs can be used, should they be photographed. And for myself, it was an interesting debate that I had with myself and colleagues. And I decided to participate, to take photographs. In the very, my reasoning was that I wanted there to be a visual record of all of these Russian soldiers, that at the end of the conflict, that if these people were missing, there would be a visual record that the Ukrainians were holding them, and that they would be responsible for their well-being. And throughout the conflict, the 3 months of conflict, there have been numerous prisoner exchanges. So I would assume that this particular Russian soldier, who was captured pretty early on, has already been sent back to Russia, although I don't know for sure. And constantly, wherever you go, there's signs of grief, signs of desperation, and just agony. These people are suffering on so many different levels. This is a scene from a Sunday service at a church. It's a soldier praying at an icon. These are coffins waiting for a mass grave to be emptied out for the people to get a proper burial. Now, going back to the bridge, I decided to do something a little bit different. So I did a story, not for The Economist, but for the New Republic, along with the writer Peter Moss. And we did a story kind of just about the Exodus. And you see here, this is the ground that everybody was walking on. You see the tracks from the wheelchairs and all the footprints and so on. And these people, many people were brought to the bridge by volunteer drivers or their own vehicles, which eventually wound up being blown up. They were then parked and then they had to then cross the bridge by foot. And so there were little bits of remnants of the things that they had left behind. And again, kind of this idea of like, what do you take? What do you leave? What happens to the things that you leave behind? Will you ever find them again? And what exactly does that mean? Especially as Americans, where we're very much a society of things. You're trying to think about like, what do you take your iPad? Do you take your computer? Do you take this? Do you take your photo albums? Like, what do you take? And that was one of the things I found really interesting, talking to people saying, especially the older generation. I said, did you take your photo albums, with the understanding that they might, their whole family history is their analog. The younger people, I wasn't so concerned because they have it on their phones and computers. But the older people and their parents and their parents' parents, all those pictures, and most people didn't. They said, no, we had no room, we couldn't take it. And many of those homes, their homes, even though now they're going back to their homes, many of those homes were burned, many of those homes were destroyed with all of their family history inside, which is such a tragic loss of their history. Now you can see here some of the soldiers are very young, very inexperienced.
Babies.
This is in a town called Mashon, which was very difficult to get to. It's kind of in between the two main arteries that lead up to Kyiv, and whoever held this town basically held whether Kyiv would fall or not, and it changed hands many times. And the Ukrainians were actually fighting against Russian paratroopers, the elite of the Russian forces. And we're right now about 100 meters away from the Russian forces. The Russians had occupied this territory a little bit before, but they were defeated. The bodies that you see in the background are dead Russian paratroopers. So this was a huge area of defeat for the Russians, and one of the reasons why the capital never fell. And then now, just in this sort of last section, as you guys probably were following the news and heard from the other photographers, there was an area, the places where these people were fleeing from, towns called Bucha and Irpin. When the Russians finally retreated and moved away, the Ukrainians were able to go in to those territories. And obviously there were already people that had stayed throughout the entire conflict, but there were also a lot of evidence of war crimes, bodies in the streets, people that had been shot. It's already been proven that the Russians, by satellite footage, that the Russians were in place when these bodies appeared on the ground. And you see here, this man, his name is Vladimir. He went to one of the grave sites where the bodies were piled up because they weren't able to bury them properly, and he identified his brother. And he was lucky because most people have not even been able to identify their relatives. This is a road that very early on in the conflict in Bucha, there was a huge ambush by Ukrainian soldiers on Russian troops. Numerous armored vehicles were destroyed. very heavy fighting and so on. But as a result, as the Russians were able to consolidate their power in these towns, lots of civilians were killed and left in the streets because nobody could go and collect them. So going back to this idea about war crimes, as myself and my colleagues went out onto the streets, along with, in the beginning, very small groups of investigators from the Ukrainian side, we all started documenting place after place. This is a body that was executed, and the bullet that was found by the investigator placed on the body. Here, the Russians were even so brutal, they killed the dog. The dog is dead in the wheelbarrow, and the surviving dog is paying his respects. And one of the things that's been incredibly interesting is that I think, unlike probably any other war, is that there's so much information. There's evidence of the crime, but there's also witnesses and so on. So this is a particular case where the Russians were based. They had a base like right behind this house in a glass factory. And according to two other guys who knew these two guys who were killed, they were in their home. Some Russian soldiers, including a sergeant, came over to visit them, speak to them. They said they were a little bit drunk, but they had a somewhat respectable conversation. The Russians introduced themselves. The sergeant told them their name and so on. And then 3 hours later, they came back. The same group of Russian soldiers came back to the same four guys, took these two guys away. They were, according to the witnesses, very drunk. They took these guys away. They killed both of them. The guy in the foreground, if you can tell from the photograph, he was killed first, and then they cut off his head. But the witnesses know the names of the soldiers, and everybody knows the unit that was in this area. So they have all the names, they have all the photographs, and within a day of the investigators being there, they identified by photograph who the Russian soldiers were and who took them away. So this is something I think that's completely new to this conflict. We'll see how this evidence kind of works in a court of law, but they're very quickly making a list. They know who did what, because it's all the information has been either hacked or is available online of the different units, who's the soldiers, and so on. So plus the satellite information with vehicle tags and all sorts of things. So it's going to be really fascinating. So here you see in this photograph, these are Ukrainian investigators basically doing the first round of documentation. Then international investigators have come in. They will follow up, and combined with the journalism, with Human Rights Watch and so on, there's going to be pretty thorough reports. And you also will have witnesses like this woman who was psychologically tormented by Russian soldiers, and she managed to escape from being raped and so on. And here she is meeting a Ukrainian soldier for the first time since the Russian soldiers left. And her, like many other people, will be struggling a great deal with post-traumatic stress and will need psychological counseling and so on to be able to move forward. When I arrived in Bucha, I was told, like, come to this building. Here's a site of bodies. All these men have been executed. You can see here his hands are tied behind his back, another sign of a war crime. Now, I'm not qualified whatsoever based on what I'm witnessing to say definitively this is a war crime or not, but it definitely, many of the things that I photographed and saw seem like that they could be war crimes, and that will be eventually either confirmed or denied by the professionals that are working in this place.
Ron?
And then again, because yeah.
So like situations like that, are you forewarned of what you're going to see, or are you just coming upon it with the folks that you're with? Is someone saying, like those investigators, here, look at this, and
in that particular, in the last scene we arrived, there were no investigators. Those guys were just they were just like grave workers collecting bodies. So there are times when, like, they said, like, come with us, we heard something's happened here. There are other times when we've said we found something, you should come here, we already found it. Or we're like asking people, where are the bodies? And neighbors are saying, like, oh, we think somebody is dead there, or somebody's in that house, or go here or go there. So it's a mix of different things. And then also, one of the things I think is most poignant about here, and of course in the town of Mariupol, which is always in the news, is that during the occupation, the Russians wouldn't allow there to be funerals and so on. So people are buried. Here's a, somebody's buried, or two people are buried here. It's a sidewalk grave. It's in the backyard of a home. And so the whole time it's kind of like this, it's in the north of the country where there's no fighting at the moment, except for the occasional bombing. They are basically, everything is about the war crimes, trying to collect bodies, collect identifications, allow family members to be reunited with their loved ones, and it's a whole other process of what's going on. So here in the cemetery, they would bring bodies they found around town, and again, they would be the identification process by experts, and so on. This is a photograph from a mass grave that you might have seen by the church, where they had buried, I think, 56 people, when the Russians would allow them to dispose of bodies.
Ron, how do you as a human being, I mean, for us, we're watching this and everyone is stunned and shocked. How do you go through days of this, hours of this, and then decompose yourself? Like, what do you do to make yourself right?
Well, whether I'm right or not, that's an answer
No.
other people might want to give you. But I think, look, for me, I've been doing this for more than 30 years. And I think that I have seen with other work that I've done that it has had purpose and impact, that I'm not there taking pictures for myself. I think that without question, helps me rationalize why I'm there. Without question, I'm absolutely affected by this. I was extremely upset. I think more upset by the ethnic cleansing than I was, if I want to put a comparison, not that it's really proper, but by watching the people being cleansed and the aftermath of the war crimes. But the whole thing is incredibly upsetting. And I think that without question, I think the journalism that's being done, that has been done from the beginning, not just from the international journalists, but from the Ukrainian journalists, everybody documenting this, it is incredibly important. And there is no option. It needs to be done, and it will have impact. I don't know if if Putin will ever be convicted. I doubt it. But I think the sergeant who decapitated that guy, at some point he will be brought to trial, or at least his name will be brought out, and so on. And that's important. This stuff is very important. This is allegedly a scene of where other people were executed in Bucha. And this is, this stuff is, this work is, it's a cliche and so on, but it's true. The journalists are the first page, first line of history, etc. And this war is going to be, if not already, the most photographed conflict in the history of conflicts. And I'm not talking about just from everybody with their phone. I think just in terms of journalists, of professionals, of experts, of people who are working with journalistic integrity and authorship and so on. I don't think there's been a conflict as documented as Ukraine. And so we'll see, hopefully sooner than later, when this conflict is over, we'll see a body of work that will be staggering in its breadth, as well as, I think, its accusations of war crimes against the Russians and possibly even Ukrainians. I think we will see. I hope that there's people working on the Russian side, independent journalists in some way working. I don't know if that's happening or not, but don't think that everything is just the Ukrainians aren't. I'm not saying they're committing war crimes, but there are civilians dying on the Russian side as well, and their numbers also need to be accounted for in order for us to have a full picture of this conflict. And hopefully that is happening to some degree. But I think if anybody's seen me speak before, I've said before, I don't believe photography itself can stop a war, but I think that it is a necessary component in giving information. I think, we in the United States have elections coming up in a few months. Most likely Ukraine will be part of that campaign. There are going to be candidates who are going to say, like, why do we care about Ukraine? Why are we spending money on Ukraine? Why do we have higher gas prices and so on? And then it's up to you. Look at these photographs, look at my colleagues' work, understand what's going on, and see, Do you agree with that candidate or not? And that's where one of the places that journalism, and especially I think photojournalism, can have real impact. That's the last picture.
It is. Wow. That's so what will be the determining factor for you, Ron, to go back?
It will depend on what's happening. It'll depend on funding. It's expensive to work there. Depends on if I have something else I want to say. So I'll see. I'll see what happens.
So we'll open up the chat room. If people want to ask questions, I could ask them for Ron. Everyone open it up and ask them for themselves. Yeah, from everything in the chat room, everyone is totally thankful and humbled by this body of work, Ron. It's so here's a question from Robert. How do you, a photographer, but also a human being, concentrate on making images when I would think there's always a thought of fear that at any moment you could be injured or killed?
Well, look, I am afraid from the day that, or not from the day, from the moment that the plane takes off to go to Ukraine until I, in this case, cross the border back into Poland. So fear is constant, and it is important for me to use fear in a way that keeps me safe, that I don't take unnecessary risks, with the understanding, obviously, that I'm in a risky place, but at the same time does not inhibit me from being able to work. If I'm too scared to photograph, there's no reason for me to be there. So I've learned myself, and it's a very personal thing. Each photographer for his or herself has to decide how do you work like that. But I think that whenever I'm around a photographer who says they're not scared, I walk away from that person as quickly as possible.
And is that usually a younger person, or there's just some bravado?
There are people that bravado. They're not there for the right reason. I mean, I'm not there to argue. First of all, I'm not there to determine why people are there or not. I'm there to determine why I'm there, and I always work with somebody that I trust. I worked primarily most of my time with Heidi Levine, and for a while with Tim Fedek, two people that I trusted with my life in case anything happened, two journalists who I respect. And I think that it's important to work with people that have a common goal and also a reasonably common sense of danger and risk. So
talk to us a little bit about that bond with the photographer that you'll not collaborate, but you're each watching your own backs, right? And you're watching each other. What is the brotherhood about, there?
Well, I think the brotherhood primarily, I think certainly with more photographers than probably any other aspect of journalism, in that I think that, and this has been since I started as a photographer, learning from great photographers like Christopher Morris and James Noctway and others, that the competition amongst ourselves, while there is competition between the publications and so on, the main reason that we're there is to tell the story of the people. And the more of us that are telling that story, the more impact we will have with our work. And I think that, again, this idea of making sure that you're with people that that you can trust, that people are going to, if you get hurt, they're not going to leave you to go take a photograph. They're not going to do something stupid that will cause great danger to you or themselves. These are all really incredibly important things. In war, things can change in a second, from fine to danger and back again. So you need people with some experience, and if they don't have experience, they have to be smart. And at the very least, especially nowadays, where there are courses that are available for free for journalists called hostile environment courses, which teach you how to work in a war zone, taught by primarily former British Special Forces soldiers. I would never go anywhere, even get into a car with somebody that hadn't taken that class.
Yeah.
Kind of like Fortnite, like the Battlefield.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
It's almost like Fortnite. Like, you know
Like
what I
the
mean?
game?
Yeah.
Well, it could be like lots of different video games, but it's real, right? So
Yeah, like Warzone and PUBG.
yeah, I mean, I don't play those games because I've experienced enough of it in real life, so it's fine. That's kind of limit my experience to this, but yeah, it's pretty, it's pretty serious stuff.
Real serious, yeah.
Are you like allowed to interact with like people who are like are you allowed to like go in there and like help people, or only like for taking pictures?
No, as I showed that photograph of the soldier, the photographer carrying the body, not the body, but the man who couldn't cross the bridge. I mean, it's up to us when we want to interact and so on. But I think my general rule is if I'm the only one able to help, the camera goes down and I help. If there are other people available to help, then I'm going to document the situation. There are times when you try to intervene and you're not able to help somebody, and there are times when you're able to intervene and you can help somebody. And these are all very situation by situation. There's no set rule, and you have to decide on the danger, if there is danger for you, on what you're willing to risk.
And Ron, I mean, are there any like particular special resources that they have for the press, within the military mechanism there? Or is it like you're really on your own, right?
Well, no, the biggest resource that we have in this particular conflict, and each conflict is different, is the accreditation, right? That you've been supposedly vetted by the government, that the guy on the street, the soldier with the gun, should respect that and allow you to be able to do your job. I think in this particular conflict, certainly I was not on the Russian side, but on the Ukrainian side, the soldiers were incredibly professional. I never saw anybody that was drunk or belligerent or anything. I mean, there were many times when I was told I couldn't go forward, and I would argue and so on, but it was always done with respect, and so on, which is a bit unusual. I think they were very well trained. The other bits of information that's different with this conflict than any other conflict that I've covered is that there's so much information being given out on Telegram, on Signal, on WhatsApp, on websites. This has happened in this town, this has happened in that town, and so on. This is completely new. It used to be, you would have to turn the radio on or talk to other journalists or do real research, like what's going on 10 miles down the road, or just go explore it yourself. But here, there's so much information, and most of the information has been reasonably accurate, that it's made, okay, like this is where the next battle is going to be, or this is where people are fleeing from this area. It's made things a lot easier in order to document what's going on. It's been quite incredible.
And most of that information pans out to be true and correct, right? I mean, there's no fake.
So far from
Yeah.
what I've seen, yeah, it's a great opportunity for there to be a lot of fake news and so on. But it has been, and when there have been mistakes, they've come out and corrected them. And some of it's coming from government channels, so you can look at that with a little bit more suspicion and maybe check in more. And others are coming from independent journalists or local newspapers or things of that nature. And it's incredibly helpful to be able to work. I mean, Ukraine is a huge country.
Somebody should meet that.
How big is Ukraine? I mean, compared to the United States, because that's the only thing I can compare it to.
Ukraine is
yeah.
the second largest, is about, let's see, think about Texas,
Yeah.
and that's about the size of Ukraine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Ron, with that information that you're getting, you also, I mean, it's interesting, like you're gathering this information, you're getting it, and you also have to be skeptical. Is it true? Is it right? All at the same time, right? I mean, so do you need to hear it from 2 or 3 different?
Yeah, you'll cross-reference it. So
yeah,
I'm working on, somebody asked a question about translators. So I'm working, most of the time I was working with an incredible producer named Olga, who basically before the war, she was a documentary film producer. And myself and Heidi from the Washington Post were introduced to her, and she became a natural amazing producer, and also translating when necessary, but also very well connected, very smart, and also obviously very patriotic and wanted the stories to be told. And she would we'd say, okay, we just served this. Can you call your sources and corroborate and so on? And then it would be done, reasonably quickly. But no, it's very difficult to work in these situations, especially when I don't speak the language, I don't know the place. So these people who are, I prefer to call them producers, but they're referenced often as fixers. These people are indispensable to be able to work. So what we did with Olga was we immediately, the Washington Post was very professional. They put her on their insurance. Seven Foundation put her through a hostile environment course. So she immediately was trained within a week or so on medical first aid and how to work in a war zone. And then she had, a lot of the sort of basic skill sets that's necessary to be able to work during in a conflict. But at the same time, she's taking care of her parents who are elderly, and at the same time working for us. It was she's quite a remarkable person, working in her own country, dealing with her family, as well as dealing with a job, a stressful job, going to the front lines, dealing with what we've witnessed, everything that you saw that I photographed. She was with me for.
And Ron, do we know her name?
Her name is Olya.
Just so it's part of it. Well, Ron, I mean, I'm sure you've seen the chat room and how everyone is admires you and is thankful for what you and your colleagues have done. So, if there are any other questions, or Ron, anything else you want to share with us, also, I haven't mentioned it. There are different places people can donate. Vet them yourselves, but if you feel compelled to donate to the cause, do that in any way you feel comfortable doing. But Ron, do you have anything to close us out with?
No, I know it's Friday night, and I appreciate the time to look at something that's very that's now that's part of our life, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thank you all for this really incredible week. So many of you came every single night, and we appreciate that. And this Ron talk will be on YouTube probably by Saturday or Sunday. We'll have it up so you can see it there and have